reason for why the Supreme Court of the United States has struck down President Trump's ability to use tariffs. IEEPA, they say, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. This is a judgment from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. I'm reading through this decision right now, which just came out literally in the last couple of moments here about the president's tariff authority. Worth noting that this is coming out just before he's set to go in front, of course, of Congress, a joint meeting of Congress, to talk to Democrats and Republicans. He has been touting tariffs constantly. Okay, now I have a good idea of who has joined this opinion. Roberts, the Chief Justice of the court, has delivered the judgment of the court. Also, Sonia Sotomayor, a liberal justice, Alana Kagan, another liberal justice, Neil Gorsuch, a conservative justice appointed by President Donald Trump, Amy Coney Barrett, another justice appointed by President Donald Trump, and Justice Jackson, as well, appointed by Joe Biden, joined that decision.
All right, folks, welcome to Dr. John Podcast right now. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling rejected Trump's emergency tariff authority, marking a pivotal shift. The court, which had been the administration's most reliable institutional ally through more than 30 emergency applications, told this president even he had limits. The emergency docket, designed for genuine crises, had become a systematic tool for bypassing normal processes. This ruling reined in that expansion and left the administration scrambling to understand what had just happened. The administration had grown accustomed to winning in this forum. Case after case, emergency application after emergency application, the court granted the relief sought and allowed contested policies to proceed.
Worth noting that the two dissenting judges, Clarence Thomas and Kavanaugh, along with Justice Alito, all dissented from that decision. So pretty fascinating stuff there. The Supreme Court striking down President Trump's tariff policy, something that is not only likely to get a very strong response, to say the least, from President Donald Trump, but also could have a major impact on the current world order. The president imposing sweeping tariffs on nations all across the country, a baseline 10% tariff on countries. And just yesterday, President Trump was in Rome, Georgia, saying that tariffs is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, something he's often said since the campaign trail. He's had this full-throated embrace of tariffs, and now the Supreme Court striking down those tariffs just ahead of the president's most major domestic policy address. I'm just on the president's Truth Social account right now. No reaction from him yet, but we can expect a fairly strong reaction from President Trump, especially given, Steph, and I'll let you weigh in here too, the fact that a number of the justices that President Trump appointed to the Supreme Court himself.
This created a specific expectation within the administration and among its critics alike that the court was effectively functioning as a policy partner for the Trump agenda on the emergency docket. The legal team in the White House had every reason to believe that when they invoked emergency authority, the justices would respond favorably. The pattern was so consistent, so predictable, that it became part of the administration's governing strategy, a way to achieve policy victories that couldn't be secured through Congress or through the normal regulatory process. And then came the tariff ruling that changed everything.
Join this decision with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, appointed by President George W. Bush, striking down the tariffs here. This, of course, going to have massive repercussions. Again, we can expect a very strong response from President Trump. These tariffs have largely been his idea, something that he has championed, he pushed through, in some ways steamrolling Republican members of Congress, including his own Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who has repeatedly told reporters like myself he's no fan of tariffs, but has been willing to go along with the policy because President Trump has felt so strongly about it. Now, this is probably just going to release a total tidal wave in how things turn around here, in just how the tariff policies could be unwound. Again, a lot of questions about where things go from here, Stephanie. And again, I'm just trying to monitor everything I can to just get a good sense of where things are going. This, of course, just breaking literally in the last couple of seconds here, Steph.
Hey, Nate. Yeah, I know this is a major decision that we have been waiting for from the Supreme Court. There's a few important things that our audience should note about this decision. One is this does not impact all of the tariffs that President Trump has announced. These are only the tariffs that have been used under.
The case involved involved one of the administration's most consequential claimed emergency authorities, the sweeping trade policy action that had been implemented through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The administration argued that this statute, designed for genuine national security emergencies, gave the president virtually unlimited authority to impose tariffs on countries across the globe. The challengers argued that the administration was stretching the statute far beyond anything Congress had intended, transforming a narrow emergency power into a blank check for economic policy that fundamentally violated the constitutional separation of powers. And when the Supreme Court finally addressed the question on the merits, the result was a 6-3 ruling that included Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Barrett, joining the 3 liberal justices to reject the administration's expansive reading of the statute.
IEEPA, which is the acronym for the law the president was using to institute these tariffs. Now, this law has been on the books for decades, but Trump was the first president to try to use this particular law to institute new tariffs. And that is really what the justices were considering here. So there's another major question of what happens to all the tariffs that have already been paid under this statute from President Trump, all of these IEEPA tariffs. Are those funds that have already gone into the U.S. Treasury, are they going to need to be repaid to the importers and to the businesses that have, paid billions of dollars? I think the last update I was looking at recently said that the president's tariffs in totality have brought in as much as $287 billion to the United States Treasury in 2025. Again, not all of the president's tariffs are going to be impacted by this decision, but this is going to send major shockwaves through the Trump administration. As you noted, the president likely to be very upset about this decision. You noted the justices.
This wasn't a narrow ruling on a technical legal question where reasonable jurists of different ideological commitments could reach different conclusions. This was a decisive rejection of one of the most aggressive executive power claims in recent American history, delivered by a court that included the president's own appointees. Gorsuch and Barrett and Roberts are not justices who rule against the Trump administration casually or on the basis of political opposition. They are conservative jurists with well-documented legal commitments who have, in other contexts, been significantly more favorable to executive power than their liberal colleagues. They have joined majorities expanding presidential authority in multiple other decisions. When they join a majority that rejects the administration's claimed emergency authority, they are communicating something specific and significant about the quality of the legal argument being advanced.
Who ruled against the president, even some of those justices being appointed by the Trump, but that I think speaks to the fact that we have 3 separate and equal branches of government. The justices that are appointed, whether it be Supreme Court justices or your regular federal district judge across the country, you don't want those judges to feel beholden to the president that appoints them. And so this is an example of the judiciary being the independent branch of government that it is supposed to be. I know we've got our legal affairs correspondent, Ava Joy Burnett. I know she is in the office and she, I'm sure, is pouring through this decision as well. And I'm anxious to get her take on what she reads out of this decision. But this is really just a massive ruling that we have been waiting for a few months now. And the question is, what happens next? Where do things go from here? How quickly are these tariffs pulled back so that they are no longer applied to people who are importing, billions of dollars worth of goods into the U.S., every month? So a lot to continue to dig into here, Nate.
The ruling's composition is what gives it its most devastating signal value. A 6-3 majority with the conservative bloc joining the liberal justices is the court speaking with a unified voice that transcends partisan divides. It is the court saying that the specific legal argument the administration was making did not hold up under the statutory text and the constitutional framework that governs IEEPA authority. It is the court establishing a line beyond which even the most favorable possible Supreme Court for Trump's legal theories was not willing to go. The administration had been granted extraordinary emergency docket accommodation in case after case, but the tariff ruling was the moment the court drew its line in the sand and said, this specific claimed emergency power does not exist in the law you are invoking it under. The timing of this ruling makes it even more devastating for the administration. The emergency docket wins had allowed the administration to implement its trade policies for an extended period while the legal challenges proceeded through the lower courts. The policies had been in effect, the economic relationships had been disrupted, the diplomatic consequences had occurred, and the political credit and blame had been assigned. And then the Supreme Court finally addressed the underlying legal question and found that the statutory authority the administration had been relying on did not actually support what the executive was attempting. The practical effect of the ruling was to upend one of the administration's most consequential policy achievements, but the constitutional significance extends far beyond the specific case. What the NUKE move framing captures about this moment is the specific quality of suddenness and scale that Supreme Court decisions can have. The way a single ruling from the 9 justices can reshape the constitutional landscape in ways no other institutional action can match. The emergency session quality of the headline compresses what is actually a more gradual and more case-by-case process of constitutional line drawing into a single dramatic moment. But the underlying reality that the compression is reaching toward is genuine. The court has been and continues to be the single most consequential institutional actor in defining the constitutional limits of the Trump presidency. Its immunity ruling gave the administration its greatest legal victory. Its tariff ruling gave the administration its most significant legal defeat. And the ongoing emergency docket tug-of-war between the administration's claims of emergency authority and the court's assessment of those claims is the specific constitutional battle that will determine how much power this presidency ultimately exercises. The court rejected the administration's attempt to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, as a broad grant of trade authority, ruling that the statute was designed for genuine national security emergencies, not sweeping tariff policy. The Constitution gives Congress primary authority over trade, and allowing presidents to bypass that through emergency declarations would fundamentally alter the separation of powers. The ruling sends a broader message. Even in an era of executive power expansion, emergency authority has limits that are enforceable through judicial review. The relationship between the Trump administration and the Supreme Court has been one of the most consequential and carefully scrutinized dynamics in modern American constitutional history, and the tariff ruling represents a specific and significant turning point in that relationship. To fully appreciate what happened in that courtroom, you have to understand the context of the emergency docket phenomenon that preceded it, the pattern of accommodation that created specific expectations within the administration, and the signals the court has been sending through its rulings in other cases. The emergency docket has become a central feature of the court's relationship with the executive branch, and the administration's aggressive use of it has fundamentally altered the constitutional balance between the branches in ways that will outlast the specific cases that generated the pattern. The Supreme Court's emergency docket was designed for genuine crises where delay causes immediate, irreparable harm, but the Trump administration flooded it with over 30 applications, using it as a systematic tool to bypass normal appellate processes and implement its policy agenda on the fastest possible timeline. The court granted the vast majority of those applications, effectively validating this use until the tariff ruling, which rejected a specific emergency claim and signaled that even this president had crossed a line. The court's willingness to grant Trump's emergency requests at an extraordinary rate had created the expectation that it was functioning as a policy partner. The tariff rejection marks a significant break from that pattern. Against that background of extraordinary accommodation, the tariff rejection carries a specific signal value that it would not have carried if the court had been more uniformly skeptical. It says that even this court, in this political environment, with this level of demonstrated willingness to accommodate the Trump administration's emergency docket requests, has a line. The tariff ruling is where the court drew it. The majority included the 3 liberal justices joined by Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett, creating a 6-justice coalition that rejected the administration's most expansive claim of emergency authority. That specific coalition sends a message that transcends the usual ideological divisions on the court and communicates that the legal argument being advanced simply did not hold up under constitutional and statutory analysis. The presidential immunity ruling from the previous term represents a kind of bookend to the tariff ruling, and understanding both decisions together reveals the court's overall approach to the Trump administration's constitutional claims. The immunity ruling, Trump versus United States, established broad criminal immunity for a president's official acts, effectively derailing the federal prosecutions most directly tied to his conduct around January 6th. The ruling established that presidents have absolute immunity for their exercise of core constitutional powers, presumptive immunity for official acts, and no immunity for unofficial acts. That three-tier framework is itself a constitutional landmark, the first time the court has directly addressed the scope of presidential immunity from criminal prosecution in a detailed authoritative ruling. The practical effect of the immunity ruling in the Trump cases was to derail the prosecution by requiring a case-by-case determination of which specific conduct was official and which was unofficial, a determination that pushed the trial timeline past the election. But its constitutional significance is broader. It establishes a framework for presidential immunity that will govern every future case involving presidential conduct, not just the Trump cases. The NUKE move quality of that ruling, its capacity to reshape the constitutional landscape in a single decision, is exactly what the headline framing is reaching toward. And the tariff ruling's NUKE move in the opposite direction, its capacity to establish specific limits on emergency power that will constrain future presidents as well as the current one, is the mirror image of the immunity ruling's expansionary move. The immunity ruling and the tariff ruling are therefore both reshaping the presidential power landscape in ways that will outlast the specific cases they decided. One, expanded presidential protection from accountability in ways that benefit this president specifically and that will benefit all future presidents going forward. The other, constrained presidential emergency power in ways that limit this president specifically and that will constrain all future presidents in the same way. The combination of those two rulings is not contradictory. It is the court drawing lines around presidential power that both protect the president from certain forms of accountability and constrain the president in certain claimed authorities. That is actually a coherent constitutional vision, a presidency that is protected from certain forms of legal harassment, but also genuinely constrained in its claimed emergency authorities. The specific cases where the court declined to intervene on emergency applications are worth examining alongside the tariff ruling for what they reveal about the categories of presidential action where the court is less willing to provide emergency accommodation. The disputes over immigration judges' speech rules and the use of federal power in cities that broke the administration's earlier win streak involve specific institutional concerns that go beyond simple policy disagreements and implicate specific structural features of the constitutional order. The independence of immigration judges is a matter of institutional integrity that the court has been protective of across ideological lines. The relationship between federal and local governmental authority touches on federalism principles that conservative justices have historically been protective of. The court's unwillingness to provide emergency relief in those cases suggests that the emergency docket accommodation has specific limits related to the institutional structure of government that are distinct from the policy limits represented by the tariff ruling. Together, the two categories of cases where the court declined to provide emergency accommodation, the structural institutional cases and the emergency power overreach cases, give a more complete picture of where the lines are than either category alone would. The court will accommodate the administration on emergency applications when the dispute is primarily about policy and the harm to the administration from delay is greater than the harm to the plaintiffs from implementation. But the court will not accommodate the administration when the dispute touches on institutional integrity questions or when the administration's claimed authority extends beyond what the statutory text can reasonably support. Those are the boundaries of the emergency docket accommodation, and the tariff ruling is where the court drew the line on the emergency authority claims. The broader implications of the court's emergency docket behavior for the future of executive power are significant and will outlast the specific cases that generated the pattern in ways constitutional scholars and future policymakers will be grappling with for decades. If the court's willingness to provide emergency accommodation for executive branch policies sets a precedent that other administrations will rely on in the future, and it will because precedents about court process are as durable as precedents about substantive legal questions, then the emergency docket becomes a permanent tool for accelerating executive branch implementation accommodation of contested policies. This effectively allows the executive to benefit from its preferred policies for the extended period of time that the normal appellate process requires, regardless of whether those policies ultimately prove legally valid. A policy implemented for years while litigation proceeds still has real-world effects that cannot be fully undone. Economic relationships, diplomatic consequences, and political credit and blame, even if later struck down. The court's willingness to allow this dynamic through its emergency docket effectively gives the executive a significant advantage over legal constraints. A true nuclear ruling would need to address a power claim so central that its rejection would fundamentally alter the president's ability to govern across multiple domains. The tariff ruling eliminates a specific claimed authority, but is not that comprehensive, though each narrow line drawn against executive overreach accumulates toward that eventual constitutional reckoning. The tariff ruling goes beyond Trump. It establishes constitutional limits on emergency authority that will bind every future president, regardless of party. The court found that IEEPA does not authorize sweeping trade policy actions. It was designed for genuine national security threats, not general economic policymaking. The ruling's composition is significant, including justices who have elsewhere defended executive power. Roberts, Gorsuch, Barrett signals that the administration's claim was not just controversial, but legally indefensible. The timing of the tariff ruling adds another layer of significance to its constitutional impact. The administration had been implementing its trade policies for an extended period while the legal challenges proceeded through the lower courts. The Supreme Court's emergency docket accommodation had allowed those policies to remain in effect during the litigation, creating a situation where the administration benefited from its claimed authority for years before the court finally addressed the underlying legal question. When the court ultimately found that the statutory authority the administration had been relying on did not support the policies being implemented, it created a situation where unlawful policies had been in effect for an extended period. This highlights the specific danger of the emergency docket accommodation pattern, where executive branch policies can be implemented for years before the court finally determines whether they are legal. The broader implications of the tariff ruling for the future of executive power extend beyond the specific statutory question at issue. The court was sending a message about the limits of emergency power claims in general, about the danger of allowing the executive branch to use emergency declarations as a workaround for legislative inaction or policy opposition. When a president can declare an emergency and then use that declaration to implement major policy changes that would otherwise require congressional approval, the constitutional balance between the branches is fundamentally altered. The court was saying that even in an era of executive power expansion, there are limits to what the president can claim under emergency authority, and those limits are real and enforceable through judicial review. The specific relationship between the emergency docket wins and the tariff ruling is one of the most instructive features of the court's current Trump-related jurisprudence because it reveals a specific tension between the court's general willingness to accommodate the administration's emergency requests and its unwillingness to validate the most expansive versions of the emergency power theory that underlies those requests. The court can grant emergency relief to allow a policy to proceed while litigation continues without endorsing the legal theory that the policy is ultimately valid. The tariff ruling demonstrated that the court's willingness to allow policies to proceed under emergency stays does not translate into willingness to sustain the underlying legal theory when the court finally addresses it on the merits. That distinction between emergency accommodation and merits validation is one that the Trump administration has not always clearly maintained in its public framing of the court's emergency docket decisions. The administration has tended to treat emergency stays as victories on the merits, suggesting that the court's willingness to allow a policy to proceed while litigation continues is an endorsement of the policy's legality. The tariff ruling served as a corrective, a demonstration that emergency relief does not guarantee ultimate legal vindication. The administration's trade policies were allowed to proceed for years through the emergency docket. But when the court finally addressed the underlying legal question, the policies were found to be unlawful. This distinction is crucial for understanding the true significance of the court's emergency docket behavior. The constitutional vision that emerges from the combination of the immunity ruling and the tariff ruling is one of a presidency that is protected from certain forms of accountability, but also genuinely constrained in its claimed emergency authority authorities. The immunity ruling shields the president from criminal prosecution for official acts, providing a significant layer of protection that no previous president enjoyed. The tariff ruling limits the president's ability to use emergency declarations as a workaround for legislative inaction, establishing clear boundaries on the expansion of executive power through emergency authority. Together, these rulings create a framework that both protects the presidency and constrains it, a balance that reasonable legal minds can debate, but that is internally consistent and constitutionally grounded. The specific cases where the court declined to provide emergency accommodation for the administration's policies are worth examining alongside the tariff ruling for what they reveal about the court's overall approach to the Trump administration's legal claims. The disputes over immigration judges' speech rules and the use of federal power in cities that broke the administration's earlier win streak involve specific institutional concerns that the court was unwilling to set aside even in the face of the administration's emergency arguments. The independence of immigration judges is a matter of institutional integrity that the court has been protective of across ideological lines, and the relationship between federal and local governmental authority touches on federalism principles that conservative justices have historically been protective of. The court's unwillingness to provide emergency relief in those cases suggests that the emergency docket accommodation has specific limits related to the institutional structure of government. The NUKE move framing that has emerged in response to the tariff ruling captures something genuine about the court's role in the Trump constitutional moment, even if it compresses a more gradual process of constitutional line drawing into a single dramatic moment. The court has been and continues to be the single most consequential institutional actor in defining the constitutional limits of the Trump presidency. Its immunity ruling gave the administration its greatest legal victory. Its tariff ruling gave the administration its most significant legal defeat, and the ongoing emergency docket tug-of-war between the administration's claims of emergency authority and the court's assessment of those claims is the specific constitutional battle that will determine how much power this presidency ultimately exercises and what constitutional framework it leaves behind for the presidents who follow. The specific signals the court has been sending through the tariff ruling, through the cases where it declined to provide emergency relief, and through the votes of the justices Trump appointed against the administration's most expansive emergency claims suggest that the line where a true NUKE move could happen is closer than the administration's emergency docket win rate might suggest. The court has demonstrated its willingness to reject the administration's legal arguments when they extend beyond what the statutory text and constitutional framework can support. The tariff ruling was not a comprehensive gutting of the presidency, but it was a significant step toward establishing limits on emergency power claims that will constrain future presidents as well as the current one. And each additional step in that direction brings the court closer to the kind of comprehensive ruling that the NUKE move framing imagines. The final thing to understand about the Supreme Court's role in the Trump constitutional moment is that the court's most significant decisions will be judged not just by their immediate effects on the specific cases before it, but by the constitutional framework they establish for the presidency going forward, by the lasting shape they give to what future presidents can claim and what the legal system can deny them. The immunity ruling does not just protect Trump from the specific prosecutions that challenged his conduct around January 6th, it establishes the framework for presidential immunity from criminal prosecution that every future president will operate under for better or worse, in ways that will shape the accountability of the American executive branch for generations. The tariff ruling establishes a framework for IEEPA emergency authority that will constrain all future administrations, not just Trump's. Each decision is both a case-specific ruling and a constitutional statement shaping governance for decades. The court is building something case by case. It will protect the president from certain accountability while constraining certain claimed authorities, drawing lines around presidential power that both protect and limit it. The NUKE move, a comprehensive ruling that fundamentally alters the constitutional balance, has not yet been pulled, but the signals from the tariff ruling and the votes of Trump's own appointees suggest it is closer than the administration's emergency docket win rate might indicate.